It was the fall semester of 2019, and Carolina had just moved into her new dorm at the University of Cumbers, a small yet respected institution nestled in the mountains. The campus had a peculiar charm, with ivy-covered buildings and narrow cobblestone paths. Carolina was excited to start her college life, away from home for the first time. She was eager to make friends, but her shy nature held her back. During the first few weeks, she mostly kept to herself, with the only company being her roommate, Elena. Elena was the opposite of Carolina, bold, outgoing, and fearless. Their room was cozy, with a shared desk, 2 twin beds, and a single window overlooking the campus courtyard. Late at night, shadows from the towering oak trees outside would creep in, ominously stretching across the walls. Over time, Carolina started hearing stories circulating around the campus about certain incidents that had occurred at the University of Cumbers. Among those stories, there was talk of a sealed-off room in one of the old buildings, a room where, supposedly, a student had vanished years ago. Even though the case was officially not discussed, the disappearance remained an unsettling rumor among the students. The room in question was on the 3rd floor of one of the oldest buildings, a part of the campus many avoided due to superstition. Carolina didn't pay much attention to these stories, but Elena, always looking for a thrill, was drawn to the idea of investigating. One night, after a party, Elena suggested they go check out the infamous sealed room. "Come on, Carolina, it'll be fun. You can't be here and not try to see that room. It's a once-in-a-lifetime experience." Carolina hesitated. "What if we get caught? They might kick us out of campus." Elena smirked dismissively. "Nobody monitors that area at night. We'll be back in 5 minutes." Against her better judgment, Carolina agreed. The 2 girls grabbed their phones and flashlights and headed out around midnight. The walk through the campus was silent, with only the crunching of leaves under their feet breaking the stillness. The building they were heading to loomed dark and abandoned, its windows shattered, and an unsettling atmosphere hung around it. Carolina felt a shiver run down her spine as they reached the entrance. The heavy wooden doors creaked open. Inside, the air was stale and the long hallway was barely lit by the faint glow of emergency lights. They climbed the stairs silently, the old wooden steps groaning under their weight. Finally, they reached the 3rd floor. The hallway was deserted and dark, with old worn-out doors that seemed to have been closed for years. At the end of the hallway, they saw the door to the sealed room, boarded up with wooden planks. Elena smiled, her face filled with excitement. "Here it is. Let's take a look." Carolina's heart was pounding. "Elena, I don't know, I don't like this." But Elena had already moved ahead. She tried the doorknob of a room next to the sealed one. Surprisingly, it was open. "Let's check this out," she said, stepping into the room. The room was dark and dusty, with old furniture covered in sheets and a strong smell of mold. It looked like it hadn't been used in decades. Elena moved forward with her flashlight, while Carolina stayed at the threshold, feeling increasingly uneasy. A sense of danger began to crawl down her back. Suddenly, she heard a loud noise coming from the room where Elena was. The bang was so loud that Carolina jumped, her heart racing. "Elena!" she yelled. But there was no response. She rushed in, her flashlight illuminating the dust hanging in the air. The room was empty. Elena had vanished. Panic took over as Carolina swept the flashlight around the room, searching for any sign of her friend. "Elena, stop playing. This isn't funny." Then she noticed something on the far wall, a small door hidden behind an old bookshelf. It was slightly ajar, and it seemed to lead to a narrow crawl space. Carolina's heart raced. She knew Elena had gone in there. With fear gripping her, she slowly approached the door. As she pushed it, it swung open fully, revealing a dark passage. She hesitated, but she knew she couldn't leave Elena behind. With her flashlight in hand, she crouched and entered the narrow space. The dust made it hard to breathe as she moved slowly through the passage, her hands trembling. As she advanced, the sound of a soft murmur reached her ears. At first she thought it was Elena, but the tone was different, almost threatening. Her flashlight flickered and went out. Darkness enveloped her completely. Panic gripped her as she tried to turn it back on, but it wouldn't work. She felt the air shift around her, and suddenly, a cold, strong hand grabbed her by the ankle. Carolina screamed with all her might, kicking frantically. With a final effort, she managed to break free and scramble out of the passage, falling to the floor of the room. Gasping, she stood up, unable to believe what had just happened. She ran toward the door without a second thought. When she reached the hallway, the door to the sealed room was wide open. Carolina froze, watching as a tall, slender figure with a hooded face slowly emerged from the darkness. She recognized Elena's jacket, but the person under the hood was not her friend. "Carolina?" said a raspy, unfamiliar voice. Fear coursed through her. Without a second thought, she sprinted out of the building as the echo of the figure's laughter echoed down the hallway. Santiago had never been one to believe in supernatural stories. He was logical and realistic, and college life had no room for absurd superstitions. But everything changed during his second year at Montemayor University. The campus was known for its rich history, with buildings dating back to the 1800s. Santiago appreciated that charm, although he had heard many unsettling stories about a particular dormitory, Romero Pavilion. Romero Pavilion had been closed for years, abandoned in a forgotten corner of the campus. Students whispered about its dark past, although no one seemed to know the full details. The constant rumor was that something terrible had happened there, related to a student who lost their sanity. The doors were locked and sealed, but it was said that if one got close enough, they could notice flickering lights in the windows or shadows moving in the hallways. One cold October night, Santiago's friends Diego and Monica had the brilliant idea to sneak into Romero Pavilion. It was the typical college dare, fueled by beer and boredom. At first, Santiago refused, but Diego's constant teasing convinced him. A little before midnight, they were ready, armed only with flashlights and a lock-picking kit Diego had somehow acquired. They headed towards the building under the light of the full moon. The air was cold, and the wind whistled through the trees, casting unsettling shadows on the ground. Santiago couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching them. When they reached Romero Pavilion, the building stood like a silent sentinel before them. The windows, dark and empty, seemed to stare back at them. However, the doors were easier to open than they had expected once Diego applied his magic with the lockpicks. All set, Diego smiled, pushing the door open. "Let's see what we find in here." The interior of the pavilion was much worse than Santiago expected. The air was stale, filled with the smell of mold and decay. The floors were covered in dust, debris, and remnants of broken furniture. The only sound was the distant dripping of water from a broken pipe somewhere deep within the building. "Let's split up," Diego suggested, "so we can cover more ground." Monica frowned, clearly uncomfortable. "I don't know if that's a good idea." "It'll be fine," Diego insisted, moving down one of the hallways. Santiago reluctantly agreed, and Monica followed him. They took the hallway to the left while Diego disappeared down the one to the right. As they ventured further into the building, the darkness seemed to press the air around them, and their flashlights barely penetrated the shadows surrounding them. They passed by abandoned rooms, with doors hanging off their hinges and some with graffiti on the walls. Most rooms were empty, except for one that still had an old, rusty bed frame. "Do you think any of those stories are true?" Monica whispered, barely audible. Santiago shook his head. "Just college legends, every school has its own." However, as he spoke, an uncomfortable feeling grew inside him. Something didn't feel right. As they delved deeper into the building, the temperature dropped sharply. Santiago's breath condensed in the cold air, and Monica shivered beside him. Their footsteps echoed eerily, amplified by the stone walls. They reached a staircase leading to the second floor. Santiago shone his flashlight on the steps, revealing a long hallway above. The room seemed more run down on this level, and a sense of oppression hung in the air. Monica stopped on the last step. "Do you hear that?" Santiago halted. At first he only heard the distant dripping of water, but then faintly, slow and heavy footsteps echoed from somewhere in the building. "Diego went the other way, right?" Monica asked, her face pale. "Yeah," Santiago responded, feeling a knot in his stomach. The footsteps continued, but then suddenly stopped. The silence was worse than any sound. Santiago and Monica exchanged glances, and without saying a word, they began to walk quickly toward the exit. However, when they turned a corner, Santiago stopped dead. The door they had entered through was no longer there. "What the hell?" Santiago murmured, shining his light on where the door should have been. There was only a stone wall. Panic began to rise inside him as he scanned the hallway. "Did we get turned around?" he asked, trying to stay calm. "No, it can't be," Monica stammered, her face white. Santiago took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. "Maybe we got mixed up, let's go back." But the more they tried to retrace their steps, the more disoriented they felt. The hallways seemed to twist into each other like an endless labyrinth. The cold grew more intense, and the darkness seemed to swallow the light from their flashlights. Then, they heard a murmur. At first it was faint, like a distant whisper, but soon it became clearer, a voice repeating something indecipherable. Monica clung to Santiago's arm. "We need to find Diego and get out of here now." Santiago nodded, his mouth dry. They turned another corner and came face to face with Diego. He was standing with his back to them, motionless. "Diego," Monica called, relief flooding her voice. But he didn't move. Santiago approached slowly, shining his flashlight on Diego's figure. "Hey, are you okay?" When Diego turned around, his face was twisted. His eyes were bloodshot and his breathing was heavy. Something was wrong. His lips moved, but the words that came out weren't his. "Get out of here." The voice sounded strange, as if it didn't belong to Diego. Without thinking twice, Santiago and Monica ran down the hallway with no clear direction, just searching for an exit. The murmurs seemed to surround them, but now they weren't just voices. They heard hurried footsteps behind them. They stumbled over debris, panting with the effort. Finally, they reached a dead end. Santiago turned, desperately searching for a way out, but the only thing they found was a door that hadn't been there before. They flung it open, and as they crossed through, the noise and the whispers ceased. They were outside in the cold night air, gasping and trembling. Romero Pavilion stood silently behind them, its windows dark as if they had never entered. They never saw Diego again. No one believed their story. Romero Pavilion was permanently sealed off the following week, with the administration citing structural instability. But sometimes, on the quietest nights, Santiago swore he could hear the whispers calling him from the shadows of the old pavilion. Transferring to a new university was supposed to be a fresh start for Anna. After a difficult first year in the city, she decided to transfer to a small liberal arts college in the quiet forests of Galicia. The environment was peaceful, serene, exactly what she needed to leave behind the problems of her past life. What she didn't expect was that the apparent tranquility of the campus would be shattered by a disturbing darkness that few spoke about. The dorm she was assigned to, called Villa Residence, was an old building located on the outskirts of the campus. Though a bit worn, Anna found it charming with its creaky wooden floors, large windows, and that old-timey feel. However, from the very first night, her roommates began to mention strange things that had happened there. "Years ago, this place was some sort of psychiatric hospital," said Isabel, one of her roommates, on the first night. "They say some patients died here." Anna laughed incredulously. "That sounds like pure urban legend." Isabel shrugged. "Believe what you want, but a girl last year swore she saw something in the basement." "What did she see?" Anna asked, trying to sound disinterested, though the story was starting to pique her curiosity. "A figure, something or someone moving between the walls." Anna brushed off the comment. She was a logical person and had always found rational explanations for scary stories. However, that tale lingered in her mind, even as she tried to ignore it during the first few weeks. Everything was going well. She found the classes interesting, and the autumn landscape of Galicia with its orange and golden hues relaxed her. Moreover, she had made some friends, which helped her feel more integrated. But then, strange things started to happen. One night, while Anna was lying in bed working on her laptop, she heard a faint sound as if someone was tapping gently on her window. She lived on the third floor, making it impossible for someone to be out there. The tapping continued, soft but insistent, as if someone or something was trying to get her attention. Anna sat up, her heart beginning to race. She looked towards the window, expecting to see a branch or something that would explain the noise, but there was nothing out of the ordinary. She shut her laptop, trying to shake off the strange feeling of unease. "It's an old building," she told herself. "These are normal sounds in a place like this." She lay back down, but the tapping returned. This time it came from the wall. A slow, constant knocking, as if something or someone was just behind the plaster. Anna tensed up. She pressed her ear against the wall but couldn't identify what was causing it. Even though she knew there was nothing on the other side, the sound persisted. The next day, she decided to share her experience with Isabel, trying to make it sound like an insignificant anecdote. "Weird things happened last night," she said, trying to laugh it off. I heard knocking on the window and the walls. Isabel looked at her seriously. That's how it starts. Anna raised an eyebrow, confused. What do you mean? First it's the knocking, then it starts to get worse. That night, Anna couldn't sleep. Every little creak on the wooden floor, every sound from the pipes made her heart race. She turned on the lamp on her nightstand, trying to convince herself that it was all in her head. But exactly at 2 a.m, the knocking returned. This time it was louder and coming from the ceiling, as if someone was walking right above her room. However, she knew that was impossible. Her floor was the top one. With her phone in hand, she decided to investigate. She turned on the flashlight and walked into the hallway. The building was completely silent. The emergency lights cast long shadows on the walls, and the echo of her footsteps resonated through the empty corridors. Something inside her told her not to go any further, but the sound of the knocking seemed to call her. At the end of the hallway, she noticed a door she had never seen before, almost hidden behind an old coat rack. It seemed to lead to the attic, though she didn't remember ever seeing anyone go up or down from there. Against her better judgment, she extended her hand towards the handle. It was cold to the touch. She turned it cautiously, and the door opened with a deafening creak. The smell of dampness and something more unpleasant hit her immediately. She illuminated the space with her flashlight. It was a low-ceilinged attic full of cobwebs. Dust floated in the air, and the knocking suddenly stopped. The silence was so deep it pressed on her chest. Anna moved forward, her heart pounding. Suddenly, her flashlight illuminated a dark corner. There was an old rusty wheelchair facing the wall. But what really froze her in place was what she saw on the floor. Drag marks, as if something or someone had been forcibly pulled across the wooden boards. Her body stiffened with fear. Something wasn't right. She slowly turned her head toward a nearby wall. Above the wheelchair, there was a hole in the wall, large enough for a person to crawl through. The edges were jagged, as if something had clawed its way out. Anna took a step back, trying to breathe deeply. Then she saw it. A pair of eyes were watching her from the other side of the hole. She screamed, dropping her flashlight as she stumbled back toward the door. The eyes didn't move, they just stared, unblinking. She heard a noise behind her like something or someone was following her steps. With her heart racing, she ran out of the attic, slamming the door shut, and fled the place as fast as she could. Anna never spent another night at Villa Residence. She transferred to another building the next day. But the knocking, those damn knocks, followed her wherever she went. The rumors among the students said that, after her departure, the residence was shut down, though some insisted they could still hear the same knocks, coming from the walls, as if someone was trying to get out. For years, Bruno had heard the rumors about the Valverde building at his university. Located in a secluded corner of the campus, the old hall was barely used, except for a few art classes during the day. However, the real reason students avoided it had nothing to do with the structure or the old furniture. It was the stories, the whispers passed from student to student, that kept most away. They said something dark had happened there years ago. They spoke of disappearances, strange noises at night, and figures seen in the windows. Some claimed the building had been used as a hideout by criminals or dangerous people, while others mentioned a student who had mysteriously vanished within its walls and was never found. Bruno, always skeptical, was convinced it was all exaggerations to scare the newcomers. He didn't believe in superstitions and was determined to prove that all those stories were ridiculous. That was until one night when he decided to check for himself. It all started as a simple dare. On a Friday night, bored and a bit tipsy, his friends joked about the legend of Valverde. Sarah, always a fan of mysteries, mentioned they could conduct their own investigation. Bruno, wanting to show his bravery, volunteered to spend the night in the hall. "I'm going to stay there until dawn," he said confidently, "and I'll prove to you there's nothing to worry about." Around midnight, Bruno headed towards the old Valverde building, armed only with his phone and a flashlight. His friends, somewhat excited but at a safe distance, watched from the library steps as he approached the building. "Don't let the ghost get you," Sarah yelled, laughing. Bruno just waved them off and pushed open the heavy wooden doors. As soon as he entered, a gust of cold air wrapped around him. The interior was eerily silent. He lit up the entrance with his flashlight, and at first glance he only saw worn walls, dust-covered floors, and old portraits of forgotten professors. "There's nothing spooky here," he told himself. "It's just an old building." However, as he walked down the deserted hallways, the temperature dropped, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. He kept walking, listening closely for any sound, determined to prove that everything was just the other's imagination. After a few minutes, he reached the basement entrance. The door was slightly ajar, revealing a stone staircase descending into darkness. Bruno hesitated. He didn't believe in ghosts, but basements had always made him uncomfortable. However, his friends had bet €50, and if he wanted to win, he had to explore the entire building. He descended the stairs slowly, each step echoing in the emptiness. When he reached the bottom, a strong smell of mold hit him. The basement was a large space filled with old, dusty equipment. Suddenly, his flashlight flickered and went out. Bruno tried tapping it, but it wouldn't work. He pulled out his phone and turned on the light just as he heard a faint noise like something dragging across the floor. Bruno stood still, his heart racing. He moved his phone's light around the room. "Hello?" he called, trying to sound confident. There was no response, but the dragging sound continued, growing louder. It seemed to be coming from one of the darkest corners of the basement behind a dust-covered desk. His breathing quickened as he scanned the room with his light. The sound was constant, like someone scraping the floor with something sharp. "Damn," Bruno muttered. His instincts screamed for him to leave, but he didn't want to appear cowardly. When he moved his phone's light toward the desk, he saw a shadow move. It was tall, bigger than he expected, too broad to be just an animal. Suddenly he realized he wasn't alone. The scraping sound continued, but now it wasn't just coming from the floor. The walls, which had seemed harmless before, were emitting a similar noise, as if something or someone was trying to claw its way out. Bruno swallowed hard, his heart pounding in his chest. He began to back away toward the stairs when the basement door slammed shut. He pulled the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The sound of claws scratching the walls grew louder, closer. The light from his phone caught something on the door. A human figure, distorted, staring at him through the small window. Its fingers scratched the wood and its eyes, empty of expression, never stopped watching. Bruno felt panic take over. He pounded on the door with all his strength until it finally gave way, swinging open. He ran through the hallways as if his life depended on it, with the sound of scratching following him. He didn't stop until he reached his friends. When he arrived, he was out of breath, trembling. Sarah looked at him with concern. "What happened to you?" she asked, no longer smiling. Bruno couldn't answer. He just stared back at Valverde, where the doors remained wide open and the sound of the scratching still echoed in the night. The night was unusually quiet at Luna Creek College, the kind of silence that makes you notice the sound of your own breathing. Raquel had always been a night owl, and that night was no different. With her headphones on and the light of her computer illuminating her face, she was working on an essay due the next day. Most students had already gone home for the weekend, leaving her alone in the dormitory. The building she lived in, called Fairmont Hall, was the oldest on campus. Over the years, students had reported unsettling incidents, footsteps at odd hours, whispers in empty hallways, and shadows that seemed to move around. Raquel had always dismissed those stories. Old buildings creak, and people tend to exaggerate. But that night, something felt different. Around 1 in the morning, as Raquel was still focused on her essay, her phone lit up with a notification. It was a message from an unknown number. She unlocked it, thinking it might be spam or a mistake, but the text simply said, "Come upstairs." Raquel frowned. She glanced up towards the stairs leading to the upper floors and then back at the message. She hesitated for a moment, ready to ignore it, but the unease didn't go away. A prank? Someone trying to scare her? She decided to go back to her work, though the discomfort lingered. 10 minutes later, her phone vibrated again. Another message from the same number. "I'm waiting." A chill ran down her spine. Raquel put her computer aside and walked to the window. Everything was calm. There was no movement, no lights around. She decided to call the number, but it went straight to voicemail. What she heard unsettled her even more. A robotic voice saying, "The number you have dialed is not in service." Raquel's heart started to race. She set her phone down on the table and looked again towards the stairs. She knew that the upper floors of Fairmont Hall were sealed off, abandoned for safety reasons, but she couldn't ignore the fact that someone was trying to lure her upstairs. Who was behind it? Against her better judgment, Raquel grabbed her keys and her phone and headed towards the stairs. The light from her flashlight barely cut through the darkness of the hallway as she climbed. The sound of her footsteps on the old steps echoed through the empty building. When she reached the third floor, she found a gate blocking access to the upper levels. She knew that area was closed off, but to her surprise, the gate was slightly open. Raquel paused for a moment, but curiosity won. She pushed the gate and continued. The air on that floor was colder, almost icy, and the atmosphere felt heavy, as if someone were there, watching her. The hallway was long and dark, with the doors of the rooms boarded up on both sides. As she slowly moved forward, her phone vibrated again. The message read, "Room 307. Raquel stopped in her tracks, looking for the numbers on the doors. Room 307 was at the end of the hallway, and although most of the doors were sealed shut, this one was not. She cautiously approached, her breath quickening, and turned the handle. The door creaked open. The room was empty except for a chair in the center. A thick layer of dust covered the floor and the air smelled musty. Raquel entered, her flashlight illuminating the cracked walls. Something felt off. As she circled the chair, her phone vibrated again. "Behind you." Raquel turned quickly, but the room was still empty. Anxiety gripped her chest as fear flooded her senses. Suddenly, the door slammed shut, making her scream. Her phone dropped to the floor and her flashlight went out. In total darkness, Raquel groped for her phone, but its screen remained black. Panic took hold of her, and then she heard a slow, deep breathing just meters away. Terror paralyzed her. She backed up to the door, trying to open it, but the handle wouldn't turn. Desperate, she pounded on the door and screamed, but her voice barely broke through the dense silence. The breathing continued, now closer. Then, the breathing stopped. The silence was even more terrifying until a soft voice, barely a whisper, broke the stillness. "I've been waiting for you." Raquel felt the terror choking her. She pounded on the door again, screaming for help, but no one could hear her. The next morning, when her friends returned, they found her phone lying on the common room floor. The last message she had received was still visible on the screen. Room 307. But Raquel was nowhere to be found. The story of Morrison Hall was one that every student at Redwood College knew. Officially, the administration claimed the building was closed due to structural issues, but the rumors about disappearances in the 1950s were well known. Morrison Hall was an old, neglected structure, and it was said that some students who entered the building in previous years were never found. Abandoned for decades, the place attracted daring and skeptical young people. One night, after drinking too much at a party, 5 friends, Emmanuel, Lucia, Christian, Julia, and Marcos, decided to challenge the rumors and explore the building. "I'm telling you, there's nothing in there," Marcos scoffed as they approached the rusty gates. "It's just a bunch of old rooms and broken furniture. All those stories are just to scare the freshmen." Julia, always the most cautious, hesitated. "People say they hear strange noises inside, Marcos. Maybe we should—" "Oh, come on," Emmanuel interrupted, pushing open the creaky gate. "What's the worst that could happen? We go in, take some photos to prove there's nothing, and we're out. Easy." Lucia, always the adventurer, agreed. "We'll go in and out. Besides, think of the story we'll have to tell." Julia reluctantly followed the group as they walked down the overgrown path leading to the building's front doors. The structure loomed before them, its dark and empty windows like hollow eyes. The air around felt colder than the rest of the campus, as if the building itself was surrounded by an oppressive atmosphere. Marcos pulled a crowbar from his backpack and wedged it into a crack in the front door, prying it open with a groan. The 5 of them stepped inside. The interior was worse than they expected. Dusty and broken furniture scattered across the floor, and the smell of mold hung heavily in the air. The walls were stained with damp patches, and the once grand staircase in the center of the lobby sagged under the weight of the years. But the most unsettling thing was the silence. It was so deep that it felt as if something was watching them. They split up, with Emmanuel and Lucia exploring the first floor, while Marcos, Julia, and Christian went up to the second. As they wandered through the abandoned dorm rooms, they tried to joke and laugh to ease the growing tension. However, the further they went into the building, the stranger everything felt. In one of the rooms on the second floor, Marcos found an old, dusty notebook on a desk. He opened it, expecting to find students' notes, but what he found was disturbing. lists of names with dates next to them, followed by words like not found or missing. The names matched the rumors of disappearances on campus. "Guys, look at this," Marco said, showing it to the others. Julia and Christian peered over his shoulder, their faces turning pale as they read the list. "This is creepy," Christian muttered, backing away. "Maybe we should leave." Before they could decide, they heard a faint creak in the hallway, as if someone was moving stealthily. The three of them froze, their eyes fixed on the door. The sound returned, louder this time, slow, deliberate footsteps echoing in the darkness. "Emmanuel?" Julia called, her voice trembling. "Lucia?" There was no response. Marcos, trying to act brave, turned on his flashlight and stepped into the hallway. The beam of light illuminated the empty corridor, but then his flashlight flickered and went out. "Damn it," Marcos muttered, hitting the flashlight. When it came back on, they saw something that made them step back immediately. A human figure stood at the end of the hallway, dressed in black, standing in the shadows. Marcos stumbled back, almost dropping the flashlight. "Run!" he shouted, his voice breaking with panic. The three of them ran down the stairs, their footsteps echoing as they called for Emmanuel and Lucia. But when they reached the first floor, the main doors were shut, and Emmanuel and Lucia were nowhere to be found. The lobby was darker and the shadows seemed deeper, covering every corner of the place. Panic took hold of them as they tried to force the doors, but they wouldn't budge. "What the hell is going on?" Julia screamed, banging on the doors. Suddenly, a soft male voice spoke from the darkness. "Looking for your friends?" The three of them froze, their eyes wide with terror. The voice came from the man they had seen before, who was now slowly approaching them. He wore gloves and had a cold, calculating expression, as if he were used to instilling fear. "Who are you?" Marcos shouted, his voice trembling. The answer wasn't in words, but in his movement. From the shadows, more people appeared, all dressed in black, moving silently and precisely as if they were accustomed to stalking in the dark. One of them held something in his hand, a thick rope. "Run!" Christian yelled, pulling Julia and Marcos towards the back of the building. They ran through a maze of rooms and hallways, but no matter where they went, there was always someone following them. The strangers appeared out of nowhere, as if they knew exactly how to navigate the place, always a few steps behind, always in control. In their desperation, they ended up in the basement. The air down there was heavy, with a smell of decay they couldn't ignore. As they huddled in a corner, terror consumed them. They didn't know what to do. They were trapped. "They have us cornered," Julia said, covering her ears, tears streaming down her face. But there was no escape. The men had reached them. One of them, the leader, watched them silently. He slowly approached while his accomplices surrounded them, cutting off any way out. Marcos tried to defend himself with the crowbar, but the man disarmed him easily. At that moment, the lights went out, and the group disappeared into total darkness. The next morning, when the campus security staff checked Morrison Hall, they found the belongings of the 5 students scattered across the lobby. However, there was no trace of them. All that remained was the notebook with the list of names, to which someone had added 5 more that very night. The small town of Villaflor was known for its quiet nights and scenic countryside, but there was something much darker hidden in its surroundings. An extensive and overgrown forest on the outskirts of town, known as Cypress Woods. The students of the local university always heard stories about it. They were told during study sessions or around campfires, but no one took them seriously. The forest was supposedly linked to disappearances, a place where people never returned. One night, after hearing the stories for the 100th time, a group of 5 friends, Monica, Carlos, Sonia, Javier, and Daniela, decided to test their bravery. They laughed at the idea that the forest was dangerous and planned to spend a night camping inside Cypress Woods. They thought it would be a simple adventure, with a few scares and some drinks. They packed their gear and drove to the edge of the forest. The dense trees stood tall like silent sentinels. A thin layer of fog began to form as they parked the car and ventured into the woods. The air grew colder, and the familiar sounds of the town were replaced by the crunch of dry leaves underfoot and the occasional hoot of an owl. "This isn't so bad," Carlos said, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling creeping over him. Despite being brave by nature, something about that night bothered him, something he couldn't explain. The others agreed, although a few nervous laughs were heard as they set up camp in a small clearing. They gathered around the fire, sharing snacks and drinks, trying to drown out the strange stillness that surrounded them. As the night went on, Monica brought up a local story about Cypress Woods. "Have you heard the stories?" she asked, her eyes shining in the firelight. "They say people have disappeared in this forest. No one ever found them." Daniela laughed nervously, pulling her jacket tighter. "Yeah, but that's just a legend, right? People get lost in forests all the time. It's not like the trees take them." Monica shrugged. "Who knows? Others say it's not the trees, it's something worse. People living here in the shadows watching." Suddenly a branch snapped behind them. They all jumped. The sound was too close not to worry them. Carlos immediately stood up, scanning the forest's edge with his flashlight. "It's probably just an animal," he said, though his voice was tense. "Relax, Carlos," Javier said, smiling. "We're in a forest. Of course, there are animals." But the atmosphere had changed. The relaxed mood of the group shifted to unease. The fire crackled softly and the wind whispered through the trees, but beneath those sounds was something else, like a faint rhythmic tapping, as if someone were slowly knocking on wood. Monica frowned and stood up. "Do you hear that?" Everyone fell silent, trying to catch the sound. The tapping grew louder as if it were surrounding them. "This isn't normal," Sonia whispered, her eyes wide. "Someone's playing a prank on us." Determined to prove there was nothing to worry about, Carlos took his flashlight and headed toward the sound. "I'll check it out," he murmured. "Stay here." "Carlos, wait," Monica said, trying to stop him, but he was already walking into the darkness beyond the fire's light. The others stayed in tense silence as Carlos's flashlight moved among the trees. His footsteps faded into the distance. The tapping continued, now louder and more insistent, echoing from all directions. Minutes passed, then more minutes. "Carlos," Sonia called, her voice trembling. There was no response. Suddenly the beam of the flashlight reappeared, but it moved erratically, jumping between the trees as if Carlos were running. The group stood up, alarmed, and the light flickered and then disappeared. "Carlos," Javier shouted, but all they got in return was the rhythmic tapping, now deafening. Panic overtook the group. They grabbed their flashlights and started searching for their friend. That's when they saw him. Standing at the edge of the clearing, just beyond the firelight, was a figure. At first, they thought it was Carlos, but when the figure stepped forward, they realized it wasn't. It was a tall, unkempt man dressed in dirty, ragged clothes and with a scruffy beard. He held a knife in his hand and his eyes were empty, devoid of any empathy. Daniela screamed, and the man took a slow, deliberate step toward them. The tapping continued, now deafening, as if it came from inside their heads. Without thinking, Javier grabbed Sonia's hand, and the others followed in panic as they ran toward the car. They ran through the trees, their breath ragged, knowing the man was following them. Though they couldn't see him, they felt his presence, and the tapping followed them, faster and louder with each step. Every shadow seemed to move, and the trees seemed to close in around them. By the time they reached the car, their hands were shaking so much they couldn't open the doors. Javier fumbled with the keys, cursing as the others urged him on, terrified of what was chasing them. Finally, the doors unlocked, and they scrambled inside, slamming the doors shut. Javier started the engine, and the car roared to life. Relief washed over them as they drove away from the forest. The tapping faded into the distance, but when they looked back at the road leading to town, they realized something terrifying. Carlos was still missing. They stopped on the outskirts of town and called the police, explaining what had happened between panicked breaths. The next morning, a search was organized for Cypress Woods. For hours, they combed the forest, but there was no sign of Carlos. There were no footprints, no equipment, nothing. The only thing they found was the campsite, and carved into the trunk of a nearby tree, 5 chilling words: "I'm watching you, return." Carlos was never found. A group of 4 friends, Lucia, Tomas, Raquel, and Marcos, had been inseparable since their first year at university. It was their final semester before graduation, and they were determined to make the most of it. Among the many plans they made, one was to enter the famous and abandoned dormitory Las Colinas. Las Colinas had been closed for over a decade. Rumors circulated about what had happened there, but the official version was that a student had disappeared, causing a scandal that forced the administration to shut down the building. Since then, the place had remained empty. becoming a symbol of the university's dark past. The friends had joked about entering the place many times, but they had never had enough courage to do it. That changed on a cold Friday night in October, when, after a few drinks, they decided it was time. Lucia, who had always been the most daring of the group, suggested they go, and after some persuasion, the others agreed. They arrived at Las Colinas around midnight. The building stood tall and grim, with its broken and boarded-up windows. The air was cold, and the wind howled through the surrounding trees, adding an eerie atmosphere. "I don't know, guys," Raquel said, hesitating. "I've heard people say they've seen lights in the windows and heard strange noises at night." Tomas, always skeptical, laughed. "Come on, that's just an urban legend. There's no one here." Marcos, however, seemed more uneasy. "Let's make this quick and get out of here. I don't want to stay long." With a quick push on a loose board over a side window, they managed to slip inside the building. The interior was much worse than they expected. Dust and debris everywhere, graffiti covering the walls, and a musty, rancid smell filled the air. They turned on their flashlights and began to explore. At first, it was what they expected. Broken furniture, abandoned books, and old posters still hanging on the walls. But as they ventured deeper into the building, the feeling of unease grew. The floor creaked beneath their feet, and every shadow seemed to move. "I feel like someone's watching us," Lucia whispered, looking over her shoulder. "Cut the drama," Tomas scoffed, though even he seemed nervous now. They reached the end of the main hallway, where there was a large, rusty door. It led to the basement where, according to legend, the missing student had been last seen. Marcos hesitated in front of the door. "I don't think we should go down there," he said, almost whispering. "Come on, we've come this far," Lucia said, pushing the door. It opened with a loud creak that echoed down the hallway. They descended the stairs, and their flashlights began to flicker as if the batteries were running low. The basement was even darker and colder than the rest of the building. Old lockers lined one of the walls, their doors hanging open. There was a metallic smell in the air, like rust or something worse. As they moved further into the basement, the temperature dropped even more. Marcos's teeth started to chatter. "This place gives me the creeps. Let's get out of here." Before they could respond, a loud bang echoed behind them. They turned immediately, their flashlights pointing in all directions, but there was nothing. The sound came again, louder, as if something was hitting the walls. "I don't like this," Raquel whimpered, moving closer to the group. "We're just scaring ourselves," Tomas said, though his voice trembled. "Let's keep going." They moved deeper into the basement, their footsteps echoing eerily in the silence. Lucia was leading the way when she suddenly stopped in front of one of the lockers. "Did you see that?" "See what?" Marcos asked, his voice shaky. "There was something inside the locker. I swear I saw something move." Lucia shone her flashlight into the locker, but it was empty except for some scattered papers and dust. "You're just seeing things," Tomas muttered, trying to hide his own fear. "Let's get out of here." Just as they were about to leave, the locker door slammed shut with a deafening bang. They all froze, their hearts racing. An icy breeze swept through the basement, even though there were no windows. Raquel screamed and ran toward the stairs. "I'm leaving, I'm not staying here." The others followed, but the door to the stairs closed before they could reach it. Marcos grabbed the handle and shook it, but it wouldn't budge. "It's locked! How can it be locked?" he shouted, panic in his voice. Lucia stepped forward and pounded on the door. "It was open when we came down. What's happening?" Behind them, the metallic sound started again, a slow and deliberate tapping that echoed from deep within the basement. Tap, tap, tap. Tomas pointed his flashlight toward the sound, but the beam barely penetrated the dense darkness. "Okay, we need to find another way out," he said tensely. The tapping grew louder and closer. Suddenly, they heard a voice coming from the back of the basement. It was a deep voice, as if someone were giving orders in a low tone. Raquel screamed again and dropped her flashlight. "I can't do this, I can't," she sobbed, backing away. They all huddled close to the lockers, desperately searching for another exit. Lucia's heart pounded as she frantically looked around. There must be another way out. The tapping stopped, but it was replaced by the sound of slow, deliberate footsteps approaching. Out of the corner of her eye, Lucia saw something. A figure moving between the lockers. It was a large man dressed oddly with a mask covering his face, and in his hands he held a sharp tool. "What is that?" Lucia susurró, su voz quebrándose con miedo. Tomas's flashlight flickered and went out, plunging them into total darkness. "We need to get out of here now." As they tried to run, the figure advanced. His face was covered, but they could tell it was someone hiding. A shiver ran through the group as they realized this man had been stalking them. Suddenly, the basement lights flickered on, but the man was gone. Without another word, the group sprinted up the stairs, and this time the door opened easily. They didn't stop until they were outside Las Colinas, back under the safety of the streetlights. No one spoke about what they had seen that night, but a week later, Raquel disappeared. She was last seen walking near the old dormitory. It was finals week at Monte Largo College, and the campus was unusually quiet. Most of the students had locked themselves in their dorms or the library, focusing on their studies. Lily, a senior student, felt the pressure but needed a break. Her friend Sam suggested they explore the old tunnels beneath the campus, a labyrinth that supposedly connected the oldest buildings. The tunnels had been sealed off years ago after several accidents during construction. It was said that some workers had become trapped, and the university decided to close them for safety. However, the rumors persisted. Some students told stories about strange events and accidents occurring in the tunnels, but nothing beyond what one might expect from a dangerous place. Lily didn't believe in ghost stories, but the idea of doing something different seemed like a good escape from the stress. Sam, always adventurous, had heard about an entrance behind the old boiler room in the old building, a place that had been out of use since the 70s. That night, they decided to investigate. Armed with flashlights, Lily and Sam arrived at the building. The interior was covered in dust, and the feeling of abandonment was palpable. Rusted furniture, worn walls, and a strong smell of mold made the place unsettling. "I'm not sure why we're doing this," Lily commented, walking down the hallway toward the boiler room. Sam smiled, holding his flashlight high. "Because it's fun. Think about how interesting it would be to find something down here after all these years." When they reached the boiler room, Sam located a metal grate on the floor. He pulled it open, revealing a narrow, rusted metal ladder descending into the tunnel. "Are you sure about this?" Lily asked, feeling a slight discomfort. "Of course, nothing's going to happen. Let's go." They climbed down the ladder, entering the dark tunnel. The air was dense, smelled of mold, and the only light came from their flashlights, casting shadows on the brick walls. As they advanced, the tunnel grew narrower, and the silence, broken only by the sound of dripping water, felt oppressive. "Why do you think they closed these tunnels?" Lily asked, trying to break the tension. "For safety, I guess. Some accident happened, and the university decided not to take any risks." As they moved forward, the temperature dropped, and the walls seemed to close in around them. It was then that Lily noticed something, a faint echo of footsteps coming from somewhere behind them. "Sam, did you hear that?" she asked, stopping abruptly. Sam pointed his flashlight down the empty corridor. There was nothing. "It's just the echo. These tunnels play tricks on your mind," he replied dismissively. But the footsteps didn't stop. They grew louder, more distinct. Lily started to feel increasingly uneasy. "Sam, I don't like this. We should go back." Despite feeling nervous, Sam insisted on continuing. "We've come this far, just a little further." A little while later, they reached a fork in the tunnel. The path on the left was narrow and suffocating, while the one on the right, though wider, was blocked by debris. "Let's go right," Sam said, moving forward without hesitation. Reluctantly, Lily followed him. The farther they walked, the more out of place she felt. Sam's flashlight flickered, and at that moment they heard a new sound. This time it wasn't just footsteps. It sounded like someone was moving, dragging something behind them. "This is way too weird," Lily murmured, alarmed. Suddenly there was a dull thud, like something or someone hitting the tunnel walls. They both froze, nervously glancing around. "Let's go back, Sam. This isn't fun anymore," Lily said, visibly scared. Sam nodded, and they started to retrace their steps, but the tunnel no longer looked the same. Everything around them seemed to have changed, and they couldn't recognize the way back. As they struggled to find the exit, the banging continued, getting closer and faster. "This makes no sense, Sam. This isn't the same tunnel we came through," Lily said, beginning to panic. The footsteps grew louder, as if someone were following them closely. The fear mounted with each step they took. When they looked back, they saw a figure moving in the shadows. It wasn't a ghost. It was a man, someone who clearly shouldn't have been there, and he didn't look friendly. Lily and Sam began to run, desperate to find the exit. They turned several corners until finally they saw a ladder at the end of the tunnel. Sam quickly climbed up and pushed the grate open, emerging into the open air. Lily followed closely, but just as she was about to escape, she felt someone grab her ankle. She screamed, kicking with all her strength, and finally managed to break free. Both of them collapsed on the ground, exhausted, gasping for air and in shock. The tunnel's grate sealed shut behind them as if nothing had happened. They returned to the campus in silence. They didn't tell anyone what had happened that night, but in the weeks that followed, Lily couldn't shake the image of the figure in the tunnel from her mind. Every time she passed near the old building, she felt like someone was watching her from the shadows. It was the fall semester at La Laguna College, and the excitement of moving into the dorms was in the air. New faces, youthful energy, and the echo of footsteps on the old campus grounds marked the beginning of a new chapter. Jessica, a shy but curious student, was excited to meet new people. She had been assigned a room in North Residence, an old building reputed to be one of the oldest structures on campus. Students described it as a place full of history, with creaky wooden floors and aged wallpaper peeling at the edges. Jessica's room was on the third floor, in an area that felt a bit isolated from the start. She immediately noticed that her wing was much quieter than the rest of the bustling building. The hallways seemed longer and emptier, and the echo of her footsteps resonated eerily. However, the quiet atmosphere didn't bother her much, as she preferred peace to focus on her studies. Soon, Jessica began to notice something strange. At night, she would hear soft knocks on her door, always at odd hours. At first, she thought it was her neighbors or someone playing a prank, but the knocks became more frequent, sometimes even in the early morning when the entire building was completely silent. She looked through the peephole but never saw anyone. One night, after a long day of classes, Jessica got into bed, determined to ignore the noises. Just as she was about to fall asleep, she heard it again. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. Knock, knock, knock. Annoyed, she quickly got up and swung the door open, expecting to catch whoever was responsible, but the hallway was empty. The lights flickered slightly, casting unsettling shadows on the walls. A shiver ran down her spine, and she shut the door firmly, making sure to bolt it this time. She lay back down, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling. The next morning, Jessica decided to ask her neighbors about the strange knocks. She went to Amy's room, a second-year student who lived directly across the hall and seemed friendly. "Hey, have you heard anything weird at night? Like knocking or something?" Jessica asked, feeling a bit awkward bringing it up. Amy looked at her with curiosity. "Knocking? No. But you're in room 313, right?" Amy asked. Jessica nodded, somewhat surprised by Amy's reaction. "Well, I don't want to scare you, but some people avoid that room. They say the last girl who lived there complained about similar things, knocking and strange noises, and then suddenly she left mid-semester without explanation," Amy said, lowering her voice. Jessica laughed nervously. "Really? That sounds like a typical urban legend." Amy shrugged. "I'm just telling you what I've heard. Who knows, maybe someone's just playing a prank on you. That room was empty for years." Although Jessica tried to downplay the conversation, she couldn't stop thinking about what Amy had told her. Nevertheless, she decided not to give it too much importance. That night, as she prepared for bed, she heard the knocking again. This time it was louder and more persistent. Knock, knock, knock. Jessica's heart began to race. She turned off the music she had been playing to relax and was met with the eerie silence that surrounded her, even more unsettling than the knocks. She lay still in bed, staring at the door. But then she heard something new, the faint creak of her closet door opening. Slowly, she turned her head toward the closet and she saw it was ajar, even though she was sure she had closed it before getting into bed. The air in the room felt colder and heavier. Something was wrong. Gathering her courage, she got up and with trembling hands opened the closet door. The inside was empty except for her clothes and a few boxes on the floor. But something caught her attention. In the dust accumulated on the floor, there was something written, "Let me out." The words seemed to have been traced recently. Panic gripped Jessica. Had someone entered her room? At that moment, her phone vibrated, pulling her out of her trance. It was a message from Amy. "Are you okay? I heard loud noises from your room and thought I'd check." Jessica felt a chill run down her spine. She hadn't made any loud noises. And then she heard it. Whispers, clearer this time, but they weren't coming from the hallway. They were inside her room. Desperate, she ran out into the hallway, her breath quickening, and knocked on Amy's door with trembling hands. Amy opened quickly, concerned. "Something's happening in my room," Jessica exclaimed, panicked. Without hesitation, Amy accompanied her back to room 313. They entered together and checked the place, but everything was silent and in its place. The closet was still slightly open, but when Amy checked the dust on the floor, the words were gone. "I believe you," Amy said, seeing the terrified expression on Jessica's face. "But maybe it's best if you stay in my room tonight." Jessica nodded, still too scared to stay alone. She quickly packed a bag with a few things and went with Amy. That night, she slept in her friend's room, but she couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. The next morning, Jessica went to the housing office and asked to be moved to another room. The staff agreed without too many questions. Within a week, Jessica moved to a new dorm on the other side of the campus. But even in her new room, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Though she tried to convince herself it had all been a coincidence, she continued to hear the same knocks at night, 3 slow, deliberate knocks, right outside her door.